Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating historical mystery, one that bridges thousands of miles and thousands of years. Just picture an ancient map in your mind, right? Trade routes glowing in warm tones, connecting the ancient Indus Valley all the way to Mesopotamia. We're exploring the deep, incredibly ancient ties between the Middle East and South Asia. From those very first merchants to major imperial expansions, and all the way down to modern DNA analysis, we're going to unpack the complex, beautifully layered story of the Sayyad community in South Asia. Let's jump right in.
And that brings us to our big central question. You see, in South Asia, countless communities passionately believe in their Arab or Semitic origins. Chief among them are the Sayyads, who historically trace their lineage directly back to Prophet Muhammad. But, it makes you wonder, how does ancient ancestral lore actually compare to modern genetic reality? Does the science back up the family trees? Well, to figure that out, let's trace the history first to understand exactly where this profound connection began.
Now, this connection definitely didn't just happen overnight. It built up over millennia. As early as 2500 BCE, we're already seeing cultural and economic exchanges between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia. Fast forward to the 7th century, and you've got Arab maritime traders sailing these incredible wooden dhows across the Indian Ocean. Picture them interacting with coastal merchants at sunset in historic ports like Kerala. This was long before any military conquests. Then, in 712 CE, the scene completely shifts to the desert sands of Sindh. A young Arab general named Muhammad bin Qasim defeated local forces, expanding the Umayyad dominion. It was this dramatic, cinematic collision of cultures. But interestingly enough, that was actually the first and last massive Arab military expedition into South Asia. The empires that came later, mostly Central Asian.
Okay, so following that 8th century Arab arrival, there were massive local conversions, especially in places like Sindh, where a lot of Buddhists had been facing intense social segregation. But the Arab settlers who actually stayed behind, they were a relatively small group, and they definitely didn't live in isolation. As historical accounts tell us, they married locals. Imagine these mixed families in historical village settings, fusing their traditional clothing, their customs, everything. Down the centuries, they became seamlessly Indianized. Because that initial migrating population was so small, it didn't fundamentally overwrite the massive, established genetic profile of the South Asian region. So while the large-scale Arab military invasions stopped, a steady, limited migration kept trickling in. For centuries, you had scholars, Sufi mystics, mercenaries, and traders slowly making their way into the Indian subcontinent from the Middle East. You can really see this legacy woven into the culture. Traditional South Asian Muslim scholars settling down in old towns, establishing breathtaking mosques and madrasas. They put down deep roots in places like Awadh and Bihar, and in doing so, they laid the foundational lore of the Sayyad identity with real, deep cultural authenticity. But here is where the historical math starts to get kind of wild. 1,339,734. That is the staggering, official number of Sayyads recorded in the 1901 census of British India. Just imagine flipping through these old, vintage colonial documents filled with handwritten Urdu and English. For a community that supposedly originated from a relatively limited migration of scholars and traders, that number is hyperinflated. It reveals this massive paper trail of ancestral claims across various subdivisions: Hashemi, Hussaini, Zaidi, Naqvi, the whole shebang. So how on earth did a limited migration turn into nearly 1.4 million recorded descendants by the dawn of the 20th century? To understand a number that huge, we really have to look at the sociology of the era. Sociologist Mushtaq Sufi suggests a fascinating framework for this. He notes that over centuries of changing regimes and Muslim domination in South Asia, a specific cultural phenomenon emerged. Basically, a lot of local converts began disconnecting from their indigenous roots. Instead, they started aligning their family histories with the new ruling elites or these highly prestigious Islamic lineages. So it was less about a massive influx of Middle Eastern DNA and a lot more about a cultural shift in how people viewed identity and nobility. All right, let's pivot and dive into the science to see what the genetic trail actually tells us. When geneticists track direct paternal lineages, they look at specific DNA markers called Y haplogroups. Picture a modern DNA double helix mapping out ancient human migration patterns across the globe. We're looking at two key markers here. First, there's the J1C3D subclade. That's the one that genetically connects to Arab roots and the prophetic chain. And then there's R1A, which is a deeply indigenous, incredibly dominant South Asian lineage. Now, if those 1.3 million individuals from the 1901 census were all direct male line descendants of the Middle East, we would absolutely expect to see a massive frequency of that J1 marker. But guess what? the modern data paints a highly localized picture. When commercial testing and academic studies analyzed South Asian Sayyads, like this fascinating 2022 study out of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they found incredible genetic diversity. The vast majority actually carry the local R1A haplogroup. As the geneticist Razib Khan pointed out, there are nearly as many South Asian Sayyads carrying the lineage of the local populations as there are those bearing the Middle Eastern haplogroup. This genetic distribution clearly shows that these communities share a deep, indigenous affinity with the people living right next door to them. Now hold on, we need to be absolutely precise here, because the science does confirm some of the ancient lore. It's not entirely a paper myth, not at all. There are indeed confirmed J1 subclades matching the prophetic line right there in South Asia. Genealogical projects have tested and found exact matches. For example, a Rizvi Sayyad with roots from Allahabad and Zaidi Sayyads with roots in Kashmir. And in genetics, finding even a single matching male subject is incredibly strong evidence, because that one sample validates the lineage of potentially hundreds of their direct ancestors. So for sure, the direct Middle Eastern lineage absolutely exists in South Asia. It's just in a much smaller proportion than those old census numbers would have you believe. So here is the absolute crucial point. You have to understand the difference between your direct paternal line and your overall total genetic makeup. Even for that small proportion of Sayyads whose Y haplogroup perfectly matches Middle Eastern origins, their overall autosomal admixture, meaning the sum total of literally all their ancestors, tells a story of profound integration. When we run this data through tools like the GED Match Harappa World Calculator, massive blocks of South Asian and Baloch ancestry completely dominate the results. It proves that over centuries of living and marrying within the subcontinent, the overall genetic profile of even direct Middle Eastern descendants has become overwhelmingly and beautifully South Asian. Let's actually break this down regionally to put it into perspective. If we look at a precise ancestry estimate for an East UP side, or an admixture table for a Bihari side, the specific Bedouin Arab ancestry trace hovers around just 3.6%. Think about that. The vast majority of their genetic makeup is deeply entwined with regional castes and local populations like Kayastas, Brahmins, and Rajputs. It perfectly mirrors the sociological shift we talked about earlier. The settlers arrived, they married the locals, and over centuries, they became completely integrated. What all this data ultimately reveals is the profound, messy, beautiful reality of human history. The South Asian Sayyad identity isn't just some strict biological exactitude, but it's also not just a fabricated myth either. It is a beautifully blended heritage. It's the synthesis of a genuine, limited historical migration from the Middle East, inextricably fused with the deep, vibrant indigenous roots of the local populations who embraced them. It is quite literally a biological testament to centuries of coexistence and cultural synthesis. Which leaves us with this pretty provocative question to ponder. When science allows us to look past inflated historical census numbers and see the reality of how deeply interconnected we all truly are, how does that change the way we view our modern cultural identities? Think about a slow sunset over a modern South Asian city, the streets filled with mosques and people of incredibly diverse, beautifully synthesized backgrounds. Does knowing that our ancestors repeatedly blended and shared their lives challenge our modern divisions? I really hope it enriches your understanding of just how intertwined human history truly is. And that officially wraps up our journey for today. I want to give a massive thank you to the incredible research provided by Tawarikh Khwani. Their rigorous historical and genetic data is what made this explainer possible. And thank you, the focused learner, for joining me today. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.